It was a cold, rainy night when Daniel left his office for the last time. He had been working late again, as he always did, trying to finish the report that his boss had demanded by morning. The clock on the wall said 11:45, and Daniel knew that he had exactly 15 minutes to catch the last train home. He grabbed his coat, his briefcase, and his umbrella and rushed out of the building into the dark, wet streets of the city. The rain was falling heavily, and the streets were empty. The only sound was the splashing of his footsteps on the wet pavement and the distant rumble of thunder in the sky. Daniel walked quickly, his heart pounding with the fear of missing the train. He had missed it once before and had to sleep in the office, and he never wanted to do that again. He reached the station at exactly 11:55 and ran down the stairs to the platform. The train was already there waiting for him. It was an old train with dark blue cars and yellow lights glowing from the windows. The doors were open, and there was no one around. No conductor, no passengers, no ticket inspector. Just the empty train sitting silently on the tracks. Daniel hesitated for a moment. Something felt strange, but he was too tired to think about it. He stepped inside, and the doors closed behind him with a soft hiss. The train began to move slowly, and Daniel found a seat near the window and sat down. He put his briefcase on his lap and looked out at the dark city passing by. The rain was still falling, and the lights of the buildings were blurred and distant. Daniel felt his eyes growing heavy, and he leaned his head against the cold glass of the window. He was exhausted, and the gentle rocking of the train made him feel sleepy. He closed his eyes for just a moment and let himself drift into a light sleep. When Daniel opened his eyes again, he did not know how much time had passed. He looked around and noticed that the train was still moving, but something was different. The lights inside the train had become dimmer, and the air felt colder. He looked at his watch and saw that it was 12:15. He had been asleep for about 20 minutes. He looked around the train car, and his heart stopped. The car was full of people. Passengers were sitting in every seat, but they were all completely silent and completely still. They were all asleep. Their heads were tilted back, their eyes were closed, and their mouths were slightly open. None of them were moving. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at the man sitting across from him. The man was wearing a gray suit and holding a briefcase just like Daniel. He was asleep, but his face was pale, and his breathing was very shallow. Daniel looked at the woman sitting next to him. She was wearing a red coat, and she was also asleep. Her hands were folded on her lap, and her head was resting against the window. Daniel looked around the entire car, and he saw that everyone was asleep. Everyone except him. He was the only person awake on the entire train. He stood up quickly and walked to the next car. He opened the door and stepped inside, and his blood ran cold. This car was also full of sleeping passengers. Men, women, and children all asleep, sitting in their seats like statues. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even breathed loudly. They were all in a deep, silent sleep. Daniel walked through the entire train, checking every car. Every single passenger was asleep. He was completely alone in a train full of sleeping people. Daniel began to panic. He walked to the front of the train to find the conductor. He knocked on the door of the driver's cabin, but there was no answer. He pushed the door open and found the driver sitting in his seat with his head resting on the controls. He was asleep too. The train was moving forward without anyone controlling it. Daniel ran back to the main car and tried to open the doors, but they were locked. He tried to find an emergency button, but nothing worked. The train was moving at full speed, and there was no way to stop it. He looked out the window, and his heart sank. They were no longer in the city. The train was passing through a dark forest with tall, twisted trees and thick fog. He could not see any houses, any roads, or any signs of civilization. He looked at his watch again and saw that it was 12:30. He had been awake for 15 minutes, but the train had not stopped at any station. The train should have stopped at 3 stations by now, but it had not stopped at all. It was just moving forward through the darkness. Daniel sat down and tried to calm himself. He thought about the night and tried to remember if anything strange had happened. He remembered the empty station, the open doors, and the silence. He remembered that there was no conductor, no ticket inspector, and no other passengers when he boarded the train. He had been the only person on the platform, but now the train was full of people who had appeared out of nowhere. He looked at the sleeping passengers again and noticed something strange. All of them were wearing old-fashioned clothes. The man across from him was wearing a suit that looked like it was from the 1950s. The woman in the red coat was wearing a dress that looked like it was from the 1920s. The children were wearing clothes that Daniel had only seen in old photographs. These people did not belong to this time. They belonged to the past. Daniel felt a cold fear grip his heart. He realized that this train was not an ordinary train. This train was a ghost train. It was carrying passengers who had died many years ago. But where was it taking them, and why was Daniel on it? He stood up and walked back to the car where he had been sitting. He looked at the man in the gray suit and noticed something on the man's briefcase. It was a small tag with a name and a date. The name was Thomas Wilson and the date was October 31st, 1952. Daniel read the date again and his blood ran cold. October 31st, 1952. That was the date of the Great Train Disaster. 50 years ago, a train had crashed in this same forest and everyone on board had died. The train had been carrying over 100 passengers and none of them had survived. Daniel had read about it in the newspaper. It was one of the worst train accidents in history. He looked at the sleeping passengers again and realized the truth. He was on the very same train. The train that had crashed 50 years ago. The train that had killed everyone on board. He was riding on a ghost train full of dead passengers, and the train was heading toward the exact same spot where the accident had happened. Daniel had to get off the train. He had to escape before it was too late. He ran to the back of the train and tried to open the rear door. It was locked just like the front door. He tried to break the window, but the glass was too strong. He looked around for a fire extinguisher or anything he could use to smash the window, but there was nothing. He was trapped. He ran back to the front of the train and saw that they were approaching a sharp curve in the tracks. The train was going too fast. It was going to derail. Daniel knew that he had to act fast. He ran to the driver's cabin and tried to wake up the driver. He shook the man's shoulders and shouted, but the driver would not wake up. He was in a deep sleep just like all the other passengers. Daniel looked at the controls and saw a large red button. It was the emergency brake. He reached for it, but at that moment, the train hit the curve and began to shake violently. Daniel was thrown against the wall and he fell to the floor. The train was shaking and swaying, and he could hear the screeching of the wheels on the tracks. He tried to stand up, but the train was moving too fast. He saw the passengers start to stir. Their eyes were opening one by one, and they were looking at him. Their faces were pale, and their eyes were empty. They were not awake. They were not alive. They were ghosts, and they were staring at him with cold, hollow eyes. Daniel screamed and crawled toward the emergency brake. He reached up and grabbed the red button and pulled it with all his strength. The train screeched and jolted, and sparks flew from the wheels. The train began to slow down, but it was too late. The curve was too sharp, and the train was going too fast. Daniel felt the train tip to the side, and he knew that they were going to crash. He closed his eyes and waited for the impact. But the crash never came. The train stopped. Daniel opened his eyes and looked around. The train was still on the tracks, and it was completely still. The lights were on, and the passengers were all asleep in their seats just as before. But something was different. The air was warmer, and the fog outside was gone. Daniel looked out the window and saw that they had arrived at a station. A bright old-fashioned station, with a sign that said Willow Creek. Daniel had never heard of this station before, but he knew that he had to get off the train. He stood up and walked to the door. This time the door opened. He stepped out onto the platform and took a deep breath of fresh, cold air. He was free. He turned around to look at the train, and he saw something that made his heart stop. The train was empty. There were no passengers inside. The seats were empty, and the lights were off. The train was old and abandoned just like it should have been. Daniel realized that the ghosts had disappeared when the train stopped. They had all disappeared, and he was the only one left. He looked at his watch and saw that it was 12:59. Almost 1 in the morning. He had survived. He walked out of the station and found himself in a small town that he had never seen before. He asked a man on the street where he was, and the man told him that he was in Willow Creek, a small town about 200 miles from the city. Daniel could not believe it. He had traveled 200 miles in just over an hour. The train had taken him far away from home. He found a phone and called his wife to tell her he was safe, but she did not answer. He called his office and his boss answered, and told him that it was almost 1 in the morning and that Daniel should be home. Daniel explained everything, but his boss did not believe him. He said that Daniel must have fallen asleep and missed his stop. But Daniel knew the truth. He had been on the ghost train. He had seen the dead passengers, and he had almost died with them. Daniel spent the rest of the night at a small motel in Willow Creek. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling thinking about what had happened. He could not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the pale faces of the sleeping passengers and their empty eyes staring at him. He saw the driver asleep at the controls and the train racing toward the crash. He saw the curve and the screeching wheels and the sparks. He could not forget any of it. The next morning he took a regular train back to the city. The train was full of normal passengers who were talking and laughing and reading newspapers. They were alive and awake, and Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had returned to the real world. He had escaped the ghost train. But something still bothered him. Why had he been the only person awake on the train? Why had he been chosen? He thought about it for weeks and months, but he could never find an answer. He went back to work and tried to live a normal life, but he was never the same. He could not sleep at night, and he became afraid of trains. He took the bus to work every day, and he refused to travel at night. He told his wife about the ghost train, but she thought he was just stressed. She told him to see a doctor, but he refused. He knew what he had seen. He knew that it was real. He had been on the midnight train and he had survived. But sometimes late at night when he was lying in bed, he would hear a faint sound in the distance. It was the sound of a train whistle, and he would close his eyes and remember the cold rainy night when he had boarded the train. He would remember the sleeping passengers, the empty eyes, and the feeling of being trapped. He would remember the curve and the crash that never happened.